In the seventh lecture, Paul Cantor's series on commerce and culture, he talks about totalitarianism and the arts in the 20th century. And if I say the word totalitarianism wrong 18 times in this video, forgive me, as long as we both know what I'm talking about. So he talks about Stalin, Hitler, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and then also Shostakovich. And Shostakovich was a composer in the Soviet Union during the time that Stalin was dictator, and in many ways was basically controlled by Stalin. Cantor talks about how this is kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where this was turning into a patronage, in that Stalin was this patron of Shostakovich, though this was a much more serious kind of patronage, because if Shostakovich didn't please Stalin, it wasn't just money that was on the line. It was probably his life and his family and all of these other things. So it was kind of a big deal. And Shostakovich had a lot of pressure from that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But basically just showing that Shostakovich was able to produce these great works even under this pressure of Stalin, and they were then used for a lot of Soviet propaganda. So they weren't for things that Shostakovich necessarily wanted them to be used for, but they were great works nonetheless. So I think a lot of people, and what Cantor talks about is a lot of people would think that totalitarianism was opposed to the arts, because, totalitarianism is completely wrong, obviously, and there were so many horrible things about it. It couldn't possibly have any good things, right? It couldn't possibly support the arts. But what we saw with both Stalin and Hitler was they were both very supportive of the arts, and both encouraged arts in their governments. And, Hitler had his own policy for the arts. And part of that could have been because Hitler had a passion for art. When he was younger, he wanted to go to art school. So that may have influenced it. But we saw this good art pushing by Hitler and Stalin. And because of that, in the 1920s and 30s, when these totalitarianism governments were taking off, there was a huge explosion of artists in those times. But what then Cantor talks about is that by 10 years, 20 years from then, Stalin and Hitler had both killed more artists than any time in history. So kind of just pointing out that even though they kind of had these good ideas of wanting art to thrive, the end result was more of a negative effect than it was a positive effect on the arts. I think also what people might think is that totalitarianism supports more of that modernism movement that we were talking about in the last video. And they have the similarities in that they both have a love for tech and power and new things. They want to be the new cutting edge kind of thing. And so you would think they both go after that. But once again, what we see is that Hitler and Stalin both adamantly oppose the modernism art. Once again, that could go back to Hitler's love of realism in his own art that he had done. But in any case, they were both very opposed to the modernist movement. And I think most interesting of all, what struck me was Cantor talks about how he thinks that because of especially Hitler's opposition to modernism, he thinks that's why it took off so much. So after Hitler was gone and out of the picture, it was like there was this rebellion of wanting to spite Hitler and say, because he didn't like this, then we're gonna really go after this modernism movement. And that may seem far-fetched, but I think Cantor even says there's books based off of that is a lot of the reason why it took off, was kind of this opposition from Hitler. It was almost like America had to get away from Hitler's art and style, so they went the opposite direction into this modernist movement. So because of that, it took off extremely well in the 20th century. So then going back to Shostakovich, we see that even though he had to be more commercial in ways that he didn't want to be, Cantor points out that in some ways Stalin made Shostakovich great, in that Shostakovich had to overcome Stalin, in that, these things that Stalin wanted him to create, then Shostakovich had to go above and beyond and create these other things that he wanted to. And these other works that he's created are some of the most insane masterpieces. And Shostakovich is often considered maybe the greatest composer of the 20th century. So even under these negative pressures that we all kind of see as negative, Shostakovich saw as negative, he was able to succeed and produce some of the most incredible works in history.